water pollution obviously, but also emissions from land going into the sea, what the implications are for the industry, for fishing, for food production. So if we can open that one now into the panel that we need, and contribution will be great. The creativity. Steve, of course.
Okay. Maybe I should start quickly by just going over the main pathways by which carbon enters into the marine environment and how it sequesters carbon. Now, as we know, many activities put carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere, and when the atmosphere comes in contact with the sea surface, there is a dissolution of that carbon dioxide across into the seawater itself. And in fact, our seas and oceans have been taking up vast quantities of carbon dioxide for many decades, and have somewhat buffered many of the more serious effects of climate change due to the absorption. Now, this has several effects, and when this carbon dioxide enters the ocean, it actually dissolves to create a weak acid called carbonic acid, and over millennia, that acid has been effectively neutralized by the carbonate ions that exist within our ocean. For many years, we thought that was a process which was unlimited, and that would continue to be our saving grace and mop up the CO2. However, it's evident that carbon dioxide, carbonate ion supply is not limited, because not necessarily the amount of carbon that's going into the ocean, but the rate at which it's going in is overwhelming the system. So we're seeing fundamental changes in the carbonate chemistry of our oceans, which is having significant impacts on the marine ecosystems in which exist within it. Now, normally the carbon will also be taken up by phytoplankton and other photosynthetic marine organisms, kelps and seagrasses and things like that, and then trapped and turned into carbon as well. So this is the organic carbon route. And the organic material created by that primary production ultimately ends up being deposited on the seafloor, trapped and sequestered away in the same way that leaves fall off trees into the litter, and it's locked away. In addition, there is a large carbon input from the land. We have a large project here at PML looking at the transport of carbon from upland peat areas and how changing land conditions changes the transport of carbon out and into the marine environment. And of course, there are ways in which then carbon comes back from the sea and onto the land. I talked to a couple of you earlier about the old process, or the old tradition of collecting kelp debris from the beaches and using it to fertilize the land. So very much thinking about the ocean not just as an end repository for our carbon, but also as part of the cycle. You know, there are elements of the carbon, be that for food, but also for other types of resources by which the carbon comes back. Not all marine habitats are the same in terms of the extent to which they can capture carbon. We talk a lot about the more traditional blue carbon habitats. The blue carbon is a phrase that we've tended to use for these habitats which capture carbon. So you'll have heard about seagrass beds, salt marshes, and in tropical places, mangroves as well, are your typical blue carbon habitats. And part of a sustainable and good process to protect carbon sequestration in environments is to protect these blue carbon habitats. However, many of them, despite how effective they are in trapping carbon, they are limited in the extent to which they can exist. There are only certain places where seagrass meadows can grow because they require the light. There are only certain places where salt marshes can be. However, plankton can be ubiquitous and can capture carbon, as is the muds and the sands that traditionally sit in our oceans, which people often ignore. And these are heavily impacted in things like trawling and other activities we go on. I'll sum up very quickly. I just want to bring people's attention to a paper that was published recently, which was about looking at the links of the seaweed that's grown around our coast and how it's trapped in the offshore muds and sediments, these sort of often forgotten habitats. And in essence, the ability of these sediments to trap carbon was around a fifth of seagrass and salt marsh habitats, but the extent over which they occur is vast. So even though they may seem to be less able to capture carbon per square metre, there's so much of it. And these are the areas we need to think about in terms of when we conserve areas. They may look boring and low in biodiversity, but actually they are so important in the jobs we do. And we need to understand where are the hotspots, where is this carbon going, and use that to protect it. And the final point I will make is protecting carbon sinks could also be rolled into other uses of the marine environment, such as areas of mariculture with mussels, offshore wind farms, all these areas that can help them and sit synergistically together.
I was going to ask the question actually that if you put the mussel ropes, for example, over these muddy areas, I suppose partly it's just trying to keep the commercial fisheries out of those areas as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the resuspension of material that happens through bottom fishing remobilizes some of this carbon, re-exposes it to bacterial breakdown, so therefore releases carbon back into it. So we need to find areas which are potentially hotspots for the sequestration of carbon and afford them some protection, whilst maybe in other areas we have other activities which are where we're less worried about the resuspension of that carbon. So if there are areas we are likely to be closing off because of activities such as offshore wind farms, it's best to align those with those kind of areas that also give us another benefit as well, such as the sequestration of carbon.
That was in the fine muds sediments.
Fine muds tend to be the most organically rich, and they also the high deposition areas as well.
Obviously, therefore, low energy.
Yeah. In the very fine sands, they tend to act like a bioreactor, so that lots of carbon goes into them, but because there's so much oxygen and water flow, the microbial communities break down all that carbon and recycle it back out.
So the really important sinks are the anoxic layers, the black areas beneath the anoxic layer, where the carbon is stored for a very long time. Once
it's sequestered down below the biologically active zone, then we can really feel that it's sequestered away.
Maybe
interesting. No, just really a couple of practical things in and around Plymouth that might be relevant to that is to mention and catch is that Caroline Bennett has Solar Discretion, which is very much around, it's a cooperative, fishermen's cooperative, with much smaller boats with much lower impact. So I think it's important to factor that in, because one of her takes on this is the very much reduced ecological impact of that more sustainable way of fishing, which the smaller boats do. So anything, and they were hoping to put together a producers organisation for the smaller boats, and it's less than 10 metres, I think, isn't it? So I think and it was interesting. A point that was made earlier in the discussion was using all the fish rather than just the main species that are well known. And Caroline's doing a whole bunch of work around that of the less fashionable fish. And the National Marine Aquarium in Plymouth did a brilliant piece of work with local chefs called Sound Fish, where they produced a seafood guide using some of the less popular fish. The other thing to mention is in the context of the salt marshes and the salt flats and so on, and disturbing the seafloor, is that Plymouth Sound has just become a national marine reserve park. And there are other marine parks around, aren't there, around the UK?
Well, this is the first one that's been designated as a marine park. It doesn't, with that, it's not like the national park, Dartmoor National Park. It comes with no added statutory protection, but what it does is it focuses people's minds towards the idea that this is an area of interest. And it's not about stopping people doing things. It's about engaging a more sustainable approach.
to use it in multi ways, but
Yeah.
in low impactful ways, or as low as possible. So I just think that's relevant to catch if that's helpful.
Thank you.
So I've got two, I guess. One of which is I think I know how carbon makes it from the uplands to the oceans, but could you maybe give us like a really idiot-proof summary, perhaps particularly for people that might be listening to the recording who don't know how carbon makes it down from the uplands to the ocean? And two, could you maybe speak a little bit to what you were just talking about, combined with the potential to add more renewable energy that's like ocean-based, sea-based, marine-based renewable energy, the pluses and negatives of that.
I'm going to leave that second one to Nikki because that's really her area of expertise here. But the first one, in essence, it's about erosion of soils, and it's the sort of like the making re-available the locked away carbon. So in terms of peatlands, of the disturbance of peatlands, but also in terms of it's runoff, really, increased levels of runoff, particularly when we're looking at changing in weather patterns in terms of more rainfall, different types of rainfall, different times of the year. So we often look at the rivers and see it after very heavy storms. We see it's very murky, lots of suspended sediment, which is all coming down from the uplands. And actually, with that comes organic material and carbon, along with nutrients, nitrates and phosphates, all of which then enter through, transition through the estuaries and out into the open ocean. We see freshwater inputs at one of our observing stations, which is around 12 kilometres offshore. We'll see the signal from the River Tamar all the way out there. So things that happen in the very upper reaches of the catchment can resonate down through the system, through the transport of solid material and
Thank you. So,
I think Nikki was going to talk about
Nikki, do you want me to answer the second point? So the impacts of offshore renewables. So in the case of marine energy, there's wind, which we see a lot of already, and then there's wave and tidal, which is still in development. The UK were one of the leaders in wave and tidal, but because of a lack of investment, we've dropped back a little bit now. So we see less. We're seeing less of that. That said, if we look forward to 2050, in some of the energy scenarios, wave and tidal is included in some of those. The main thing, though, that we're likely to see is an increase in the offshore wind, which we're more familiar with. The impacts are very variable, and a lot of the research that's been done on a small scale, so understanding what perhaps one wind farm will do, or perhaps 20 wind farms will do. What we haven't done, what we don't know much about, is the cumulative effects. So what happens when all of a sudden we've got 100 very, very big wind farms? 100 very, very big wind turbines. So I can talk to one or two, but bear in mind that the cumulative effects, we don't really know yet. We haven't done the research. We're starting to. In the lab, we've got models where we're starting to do this. So the impacts that we see are at different stages. So when they're being put in, it's very noisy, very loud at the construction point. So potential impacts on marine mammals, sharks, large organisms who are sensitive to noise and changes in the environment. Other negative impacts, once they're in situ, is on the fishing industry. So obviously sometimes they can provide a block to some fishing vessels because they just can't find their way through. That said, there are positive benefits. So as a side effect, there's a good chance that they might provide a marine protected area as a sort because it stops other people coming in. So it can have a positive effect. It's been argued against, though, that that those marine protected areas, because you've got cables under the seabed and you've got noise at the turbines and you've got vehicles coming out, boats coming in and out to check on the wind turbines, there still is an impact. So selling them as marine protected areas is not ideal because they're not really. They're protected to a degree, but we should be very careful not to just assume that those benefits will go hand in hand. And providing a very mixed picture, I'm quite aware of that. It's because it is a mixed picture. We get a lot of benefits in protecting these areas. We see a fundamental shift in some of the species. They provide a substrate for different organisms to come and live. So you may see a shift in your diversity. You get perhaps more crabs, more lobsters, Other species that might have lived there previously would now be alienated from that environment. So pros and cons, and it depends a lot on where they're sited. It's because it depends, for example, one of the things that we've looked at in some detail is to look at marine mammal travelling routes to make sure that we're not positioning them in places that will impact these very charismatic marine animals that travel long distances. So it depends where you're putting them, and it depends a lot on the scale of the wind farm that's in place. I think we need to be, again, very cautious going forward, because there is this idea that we can just solve the problem, because a lot of people, when they look out at the sea, there's nothing there, is there? You look at it and you think, oh, well, there's nothing there, we can just put them in there. And I've spoken a lot with the industries, and they seem to have no idea that actually when you look at the Crown Estate maps of what's happening in the marine environment, it's all going on out there. There's shipping, there's fishing, there's the marine mammal routes, there's a huge amount of activity. Just because it looks like a big grey expanse, it really, really isn't. It's a busy old place in the marine environment. So I think we need to be cautious going forward. There's a lot of potential benefits, and a lot of the research we're doing now is about that. It's looking for co-benefits and minimising the negatives. So I presented you a very mixed picture. It is a mixed picture. That's why. Yeah.
Do we know at the moment about which are the key areas that require protection already, and are they receiving it? Are there dead zones close to Devon? I'm very ignorant about that. So special zones and dead zones.
Yeah.
Would one suggest to increase that protection in a way? And I also was really interested in the smaller boat fisheries. So that's a wonderful example, but presumably to make room for those kind of fisheries, there are implications for quotas, and there are implications for what larger boats are allowed to do. What are those measures that are being requested?
Do you want to answer?
I can answer that, but I'm conscious I don't want to give other people a chance to talk. Right? Do you want me to specifically answer? Should we take those, and I'll come back to answer that once
so
we've
I
heard
think
from them.
we had you first, then Nigel, and then Isabel, and Alison.
Yeah, it was to talk about thinking again about the interface between the land and the sea, and you're talking about the carbon coming down from the uplands. If we are maybe looking more at a better land use where we don't get runoff either from the uplands or from more lowland farms, certainly we want to avoid chemical runoff, but even soil runoff at the moment under our present farming system that's possibly been going back for about 100 or so years, we have had that sediment and soil going into the rivers and into the estuaries. If we decide we want to stop that happening, is that actually potentially going to have an impact on, where there may be an ecosystem that has been depending on this extra nutrient? Is there a chance that we, with the best intention, we may then shift something the wrong way? Is that been looked at?
So to answer that question, again, this big project I spoke about earlier, the Locate project, is looking at all the implications for carbon transport from upland down through the Tamar and out into the coastal ocean as well. So hopefully there will be some evidence coming from that project that will help us to guide that from there. Yes, we see significant changes in ecosystems when we change the supply of nutrients and sediments. The sort of clean start program, where there's a decade or so ago, where there was a concerted effort to clean up the amount of wastewater entering, particularly Plymouth Sound, had a significant impact on the health and well-being of the ecosystems in the Sound. So, and when I'll get on to talk about dead zones later, but oversupply of nutrients is the primary cause for the loss of oxygen, which fundamentally drives these dead zones or hypoxic, low oxygen areas. As yet, we don't really see them, although there is evidence that with increased eutrophication, coastal systems like the ones of Devon can experience periods of low oxygen.
I think several of our estuaries are actually seeing impacts of too much runoff already. We're getting a lot of green algae growing over the mudflats. The Kingsbridge estuary suffers from blooms of an organism called dinoflagellates. It makes the water very red. They could suck up the oxygen and potentially cause dead zones in the future. We don't know. But I think we feel it's very important to try and reduce this runoff and keep the carbon and all the other stuff that comes with it, the silt included, up on the land, both for the benefit of farmers and gardeners, but also to allow the ecosystems within their estuaries to be healthy and do their natural catchment wastewater treatment system, rather than the excesses that we're adding to it, which are probably despoiling the workings of these areas.
Some supply is good, but at the moment we're seeing an excess.
Yeah.
Again, just to reflect what we're doing in North Devon, we take that catchment and the whole marine approach. The Bice Reserve goes from the top of the catchments, it goes 12 miles beyond Lundy. And then with the Devon Marine Pioneer, I mentioned the landscape pioneer, Marine Pioneer as well. And that's going out to 20 miles, just as kind of boundary conditions to work to. So within that, we're looking at different ways to look at marine protection. That's sort of best done in the right places, because at the moment the NPAs are being designated based on features of conservation interest. So single species, single items, and not really on systems. And again, all the management exclude off these large boxes and saying, what's it mean with these pink sea fans, these half dozen pink sea fan individuals right in the middle of it? What does that mean for them? In which case, you've got a whole area that's locked off, potentially, with a kind of paper park, really, label to it. So, because it's all about these pink sea fans, and all this productivity can still go on around it. But the opportunity is there to actually sort of look at how you can take that into the management of the whole system, whether it is for the fine sediments and things, you can actually get more. In North Devon, we're particularly challenged because we've got the Severn Estuary, Bristol Channel, and the Torridge Estuary, which are particularly turbid environments. So in terms of trying to sequester more carbon, we've done some modelling to look at where we could do seagrass, for example. And there was records of seagrass in the estuary 30 years ago, with no proof study, but we think they were actually sort of shards washed in from somewhere else. But the challenge there, I'd say, is light attenuation because of the water column. So we'll be looking there at whether we can re-establish an intertime seagrass beds, which sort of help with that, but it'll be in a fairly small patch. As Steve was saying, the opportunities for these areas to sequester carbon could be fairly small. Likewise, we're doing more around salt marsh restoration. We've been restoring salt marshes there for 20 odd years, but now we're going to actually do the best kind of salt marsh. Nicky's been doing some good advice on that as well. Previous papers to say, well, what this one, because you get upper, middle, and lower salt marsh. Each one works differently in terms of its ecosystem services and the benefits it gives. So what is a balanced estuary look like? What's a healthy estuary look like? And where should we actually do those realignments to make that work? And all those have benefits for fisheries, etc. And then when it comes to fisheries management, where we're trying to take it is more to local and community-based fisheries management. So trying to get more small boats looking at low impact fisheries and how to get those accredited and what does it mean for different habitats we can manage. Because talking to the local fishermen up in North Devon, what they're saying is, yes, they can work with the NPAs that they helped us designate in the first place, but they've said to see the benefit of Lundy and having a low take zone, what it meant for lobster populations there, so they could do the same, have temporary low take zones, etc. So again, in the Pioneer, the questions being asked of us, if there was an equivalent of countryside stewardship at sea, what would it look like? And that's got all sorts of problems associated with that. Who has the rights, who has the tenure, etc. Because it's supposed to be an open common fishery and this sort of thing, it's a common pool of goods. And how do you control that? But that's the kind of challenge we're looking at. So if you can do equivalent of an agri-environment scheme, so a fisheries environment scheme, how do you get things just to sort of step back enough for 10 years, 15 years, to allow some of the stocks to recover and some of the habitats to recover, and then see how it works. So where our head is at the moment.
Can you include me in the list?
Oh, sorry, I can see.
Yes, sorry, I jump in.
I was the forerunner. Can I
Okay,
jump
sorry.
in?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, sorry. So you probably know that the South Devon and Channel shell fishermen are the only body of fishermen in the whole of the UK to have an independent bilateral agreement with their compatriots across the Channel, and they come to agreements about where they can fish and how much they can fish for. And I think, in terms of common core resource management of fish, I think that's a really positive thing to look at in the way forward. And sticking with fish for a moment, having been to Brixham Harbour and talked to people down there and hearing about the quantity of sea bass that is landed, but because there aren't quotas or landed onto the boat, there aren't quotas to bring it to shore, it gets thrown back in the sea. Essentially kind of dead fish that are not then going to be eaten. If we can change fishing quotas, I don't know, that's probably impossible to do because it's very high level agreement stuff, but it just seems madness to throw good fish back into the sea to die in the sea. In terms of plastic pollution in the sea, the fact that every trawler probably dumps about 2 tons of plastic dolly rope into the sea every year is surely something that we can start to tackle. And sea defences as well. So Brixham Harbour Wall has been repaired various times after storms, but there's no fund that enables such an important harbour wall that's protecting a really high value fleet from storms to be repaired to the extent that it needs to be repaired before the next storm happens. So the way that the funding for infrastructure works is it has to be destroyed before it can be repaired, and that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Sorry to jump in on that. There's some really fantastic, exciting opportunities when we talk about sea defences and talk about marine infrastructure in how we can sort of green those up and they become more natural in their sort of appearance and their function. I know there's a lot of work being done on trying to create that better resembles the form and function that is provided by natural coastlines. And thinking more creatively about how we build these things, I think would be a good step. So I'm jumping.
I was just going to come back to peatlands because obviously Dartmoor holds a lot of that peatland. We did a survey with the University of Exeter 2 or 3 years ago, which suggests that only 1% of our peatland is functional. So there is a big problem there in terms of the state of that habitat. And there is an ongoing programme at the moment to do some restoration, but it's very expensive, and the level at which we're progressing is slow and small. We need to bring everybody on board with us, including the farming community and the province. So there is a problem both in the state of that habitat, but then added to that is the whole issue around climate change and runoff associated with that, not just on the peatlands but across the whole of the national park and the county as a whole, which is increasing that other runoff. And we see it all the time, don't we, when we drive around our lanes and that runoff onto the streets. So there's 2 sides again to that coin. But the peatlands, if we are going to repair them, it's going to take a lot of time and effort.
So I guess I'm going to kind of pick up on Steve's thing about erosion as well, because we talked about actually what are the simple measures that we could do across the county, and actually even before we get to sequestering more carbon, stopping loss of soil carbon is a really basic thing. And one of the challenges that we have is a lot of the enforcement agencies like the Environment Agency and others are now completely toothless because they've been so gutted by national government. So I guess one of the questions is what role can local government or civil society play in fulfilling that function? I would also like to propose that instead of targeting any penalties at tenant farmers, we're really under the cosh as we've already established that actually it's the responsibility there should be on the landowner, because it is the natural capital of the landowner that is being lost, and I think it should be on the landowner when that happens to take any penalties and to take remedial action and to work with their tenant to do so, of course, but I really think it should be on the landowner. And this is
just to raise like a really theoretical challenge, but I think quite an important one, that if climate change is a real crisis, at what point are we going to start treating it like a real crisis? And at what point does that butt up against private property rights? And how do we overcome that challenge? Because we are already seeing, and we are likely to increasingly see, situations where you have a private property owner or whose management practices are having a negative conflict against, they're not in the interest of the public good. So where the actions of private property owners are against the interests of the wider national region, it was very state heavy, and it was like, well, we want, in order to achieve our big national challenge objective, we're just going to wade in and we're going to take it out and we're going to do this. And I think I would quite legitimately say that is not desirable, and that we want it to be a collaborative effort. But I think we need to start thinking about what the framework for collaborative decision making around those challenges is now, so that we're not waiting for the worst case scenario and then wading in a really heavy handed way. We start developing a democratic process that deals with those challenges now. And this is an unbelievably basic question, but if we're talking about how actually the best approach might be a catchment approach, and we're looking at the protection of our rivers, is it best to like start at the uplands and work down, or is it best to start with the land closest to the river and work out?
So it kind of ties in with that really, and from the agriculture side, there are a lot of tried and tested and well-known methods for conserving soil and reducing soil erosion. For example, minimal tillage, that kind of thing, and also in terms of nitrogen runoff, very simple stepping stone measures that can be taken, like regulating nitrogen applications and policing the sort of application of nitrogen and that kind of thing.
Can I just really quickly interrupt, because that was the other point that I forgot, is that I think we should have an ambition, and maybe the ambition is to be the UK's first organic county. And that was on my post, I just forgot it.
Okay. I also wanted to just kind of wave a little flag for upstream thinking, which is a collaborative project that's going on in Devon already, which I think a lot of people know about. And I had a question regarding our sort of upland catchment areas, and obviously Dartmoor represents a huge proportion of that. And so I'm aware that there are barriers in terms of private land ownership and farming in Dartmoor, in terms of, for example, things like reforestation, natural regeneration, the kind of things that would help to take up surface runoff and sequester carbon and buffer against flood damage. But there's also a barrier in the commoner grazing rights on the moor. So the 1985 Commoners Act for Dartmoor, which prohibits the planting of more than an acre of woodland in any one place, which can't be within a mile of any other piece of woodland. And so there are some significant barriers there. So I wonder what potential do you think there is for because it feels like an easy win, doesn't it? Take that marginal line, that marginal land, steep-sided river valleys, and just allow them to naturally regenerate, reforest them. What work has National Park done on those kind of objectives?
So I think if you go on to Dartmoor now, you'll actually see it's already happening. There are some areas of Dartmoor where you can actually start to see that natural regeneration already happening, because a large amount of stock has been taken off. So I think the key thing here, and at the moment we've got landowners and we've got commoners with an interest in that land. So what we need to do is to work with them to identify what we think the vision for their land is and how we can actually go about delivering that with them. And I think that there are lots of people who understand these issues now and are willing to start thinking about them. Now, in terms of the Dartmoor Commons Act and other legislation, we've got pilot projects going on, for example, Natural Flood Risk Management Project, which is looking at some of those kinds of options. How might we do this? What would be the public perception of that? How would we overcome some of these issues? So we're starting to think a little bit around that at the moment. And there is a review of the National Park Management Plan going on at the moment, and these ideas are starting to sort of take hold of it. But my feeling is that we need to work with those land managers and make sure that what's being put in place also works for them. And I think we can get them to really impose things.
Sorry, could I just also say that I wonder whether, as part of incentive, because it's very sort of low productivity land, a lot of it's raising that anyway, whether more woodland and also not only woodland but also naturally generated areas could present an opportunity for more income from tourism as a sort of transition for farmers. It's just a thought.
And that depends on whether those farmers want to go down that route, doesn't it? Really?
So
We're moving from the marine scenario.
Yes, so we need to start wrapping up. So I'm going to give the people that have wanted to speak, but if you could please be brief, because we would like to summarize some of the ideas just to make sure that we consolidate the important things that have been raised today, and I think there are quite amazing ideas that can be put into proposals. So I'll have Ian and then Steve, and then if you can be brief as well, that'd be great. So
okay, thank you. So yeah, a couple of good practice examples to talk about really locally. One is with regard to the management of the land to stop runoff. There's some brilliant work done by an organisation called Tamar Organics, not to be confused with Tamar Grow Local, although the two overlap. Where they do a lot of work with very well-established pasture with very, very deep roots and arable lays and so on. And I went to a brilliant conference with the West Country Rivers Trust about the advantages of that. So just to mention that, to catch it. The other thing is that Plymouth is working towards sustainable fish cities status, and that's done through the National Marine Aquarium as the lead partner on that, doing some great work. I think there's an opportunity there because, again, I think if we work with that and encourage people to buy in, then I think the NMA is already doing some good work towards that. So, and obviously, Food Plymouth is very supportive of that. And the Sustainable Fish Cities is out of Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food Farming and Fishing. So, thank you.
thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go back and answer some of the things you asked me about previously, and I think there's three things I want to mention. First one is about protection. Sorry.
Mine's more of a question, so that's why I was wondering.
Maybe we'll leave you at the end then.
Yes.
Is that
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Okay.
So yes, I was just wanting to raise a bit more about the local fishing economy and how vibrant or non-vibrant that is at the moment, and also the challenge people haven't mentioned, the changes that potentially can have with Brexit and the changes that may come around fishing.
The fishing industry is not really my area of expertise, so I will leave that to others to comment on that. But I do acknowledge the importance of the fishing industry, particularly to Devon, and it has, we have to embrace a sustainable fishing industry, and also Brexit is going to provide us with challenges, maybe opportunities, but primarily challenges. So the three things I was going to talk about. The first one is protection. And I think this goes right across marine terrestrial habitats, that often protection is designated based on biodiversity or particular species, and we have not really thought about protecting habitats or systems based on their provision for climate services. Whether we want to move towards, because they're not always the same places, or maybe we want to think more about how we protect those areas of providing other goods and services that aren't necessarily related to biodiversity. Ownership, we talked a lot about landowners, but in essence in the ocean, the primary landowner of the seabed is the Crown Estates. We need to ensure we engage with the Crown Estates, and as I see, they have two very conflicting obligations. One is about managing the seabed to the benefit of the nation. The other one is about generating income for the Crown. I think that they probably are in conflict in some instances. And do we want to ensure that we have a seabed owner that is more focused on the managing of that system for the benefit of the nation, rather than being expected to generate revenue for the Crown itself? But whatever way we go forward, in order to have a good plan for Devon, the Crown Estate has to be engaged with this process. And the other one is about the idea of farming. if we think about aquaculture as farming of the sea, let's make sure marine aquaculture is part of the whole farming debate. And also we talked about the management, spatial management of land, and marine spatial planning is key to be able to deliver all the things we are asking our marine system to provide.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so unfortunately, this is really great, and it's a shame all the time is too short. And you've made amazing contributions.
We did promise them a 1 minute last minute.
Oh yes, okay. Can it be 1 minute?
but you might want to summarise.
I might have to summarize. I have to leave at 12:30, unfortunately, so I could summarize.
I think we should give you the first chance, and then if we have 1 minute each to finish, you may already have mentioned some things which will make people convinced that their point is being taken on board.
So from today's discussion, I have taken some notes and some headings. So please, if I'm getting things wrong, obviously feedback. And if I'm missing things, then all the same. One of the things that was mentioned today was about metrics, sustainability metrics, and that they need to be identifiable, but also practical. And this is application of farms and etc. Also about landowners and a network of landowners might be a good idea, particularly in the context of education and maybe on the context of farm business structure. Food distribution for local produce and linking that to local consumption, because it's obviously not just about producing and distributing, but you need somebody who will take up that food. And within that is the practice of having small abattoirs or maybe mobile abattoirs that will help to have this local consumption. And then from the public point of view, the nutritional value of food and aiming at, for example, not just the public in general, but also schools and hospitals, what is required in terms of nutrition. And then obviously we should not be leaving out supermarkets. They have a big role, so how we can engage with supermarkets to make sure that they are part of the process. Farmers, so it was mentioned about their debt, but also about reward. So taxes was also mentioned, so we need to take care of that. And the fact that the price is possibly too high, and we maybe need to shift how cost is structured to improve this. I'll be waiting for the end. And then in terms of the diet, so vegan diet versus meat diet, for example. So I think the consensus is that we probably should eat less meat, but in a sustainable way, but also that we should use other sources of meat because they exist, and that also includes obviously fish. But also what the role of animals is in putting organic carbon. Then in terms of the marine, so that the marine becomes part of the full cycle, so we should not forget that it's there, especially for our county. We got two sides of the county surrounded by sea, and what opportunities there are to sequester carbon and also to provide energy, and what the impact of this energy provision is in terms of the marine life, etc. Then how we can protect the marine environment, looking at the whole system, and restoration of habitats. So which ones we should be focusing to try to restore, for example, salt marshes. Targeting quality, what is a healthy habitat? So what we expect that habitat to be like, what is an acceptable healthy habitat. So countryside stewardship was mentioned, and fishing quotes, but also pollution. So plastic pollution, wastewater pollution, and any point sources of pollution that go to the sea. See the fences? Can we make them look natural? Can we be a
Naturally.
function naturally, but also that they are a little bit more blended in the environment? And the effect of climate change. So let's not forget that climate change also has a feedback. So we are causing it, but the fact that it happens is coming back to help to haunt us again. And penalties that should be perhaps on the landowner, but let's not forget the ground. The crown, they also have a role, and we also have to protect the environment because the land belongs to somebody else or belongs to everyone. And also how we can protect the local fishing economy as part of the future.
Thank you, Laura. That was really helpful. Sorry. So, in addition to that, we would like to hear your last thoughts about anything key that you might wish to add or to emphasise. So, I don't know which way round we should go. Perhaps we should go the opposite way from which we started. Do you feel happy to start off with that?
I think it's just to emphasise the point, really working on a systems basis rather than sort of individual silos of trying to address the problem. So catchment 2C, and start at the top of the catchment, or wherever the problem starts, and work to it sort of down from there, rather than define solutions all the time. And I'll speak as a forester now and say, yes, woodlands will be definitely part of the solution. We should be applied. And again, it's productive woodlands because you can take that timber and you can lock that timber into a building, which means actually it is sequestered for even longer than natural decay. So again, you keep that sort of track going on. And again, it's coming through to the marine part, applying the lessons that we have on land. We've been very good at sort of managing this resource on land for quite some time. I say very good, I should get quite bad at it. But it's the ways that we try to deal with solutions. We should be looking at ways we apply those solutions at sea as well, because it's certainly managing the marine environment is eons behind the sort of things we try to do on, just because, as somebody said earlier on, they just see a great thing out there and don't know what the hell's going on underneath it. So it's taking those lessons and applying that.
Following from Andy then, I think managing the marine environment is more about stopping the issues and then allowing the marine environment to look after itself. There's also a question of who owns the bed of the seas and our estuaries. The Duchy is involved in that as well, but also who think that they own the surface of the sea or the water of the sea itself. I mean, that industries played a huge part in those areas of marine conservation zones that we weren't allowed to designate. Top to bottom with slowing the flow, definitely, but also we've had a lot of stuff about landowners, but we are tiny landowners and we all have choices about how we use our gardens, where we take our grass cuttings into the nearest stream, and also what we put down in the kitchen sink. These are all nutrients and carbon that will eventually, yes, it's broken up and it looks nice and clean, but it adds to the nutrient loading on our estuaries and our sea. And the last thing is security. So with these man-made eco-enhancements, there is a danger that we could also be enhancing those areas for Pacific oysters and other non-native species.
Yes, it's been really nice to hear that everybody seems to favour a very holistic and joined up approach. And obviously, from my perspective, very interested in supporting a transition towards more agroecological methods, and thinking about how we can do that on a county-wide basis and a collaborative basis with landowners and farmers, and how we can speak to the public about it as well. So it feels like there's a campaign here which is going to be sort of educating the public as well as educating the farmers and landowners and bringing people that we're trying to move on. Interested in looking at sort of supply chain, so localization, regulations of supply chain, and I think also, in this whole systems approach, looking at the multiple factors at play, so not just looking at carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, but also looking at biodiversity, food security, water quality, and the local economy as well.
my final ones, I think regardless of the systems and problem is monoculture, and we need to facilitate greater complexity. We're not talking about drinking water, which is nuts, and we're not really talking about you touched a little bit then, but actually it's mad that we put so much energy into processes and cleaning water to flush our toilets with. That whole system really needs looking into and should definitely be part of this. Can I have some money to protect trees? Because loads of people keep trying to give me free trees, which is amazing, and I would have planted thousands of them if somebody would give me the money to fence them, or offer them any kind of protection during the establishment phase. Land use needs to be gearing up for climate mitigation and adaptation. It's no point talking just about carbon sequestration. It has to be looking at climate adaptation now, because that is where we've got to. And we haven't really talked about, but I think there's a lot of potential in the renewable energy hubs, particularly utilising waste materials, and I think that could potentially be an income stream that helps mitigate some of the financial implications of the other measures under discussion.
Yeah, I'm probably going to say lots of what people have said, but I think there is real merit in the integrated landscape approach. I think what we need to be thinking about is resilient habitats, because I think for me that's actually the key to all of this, right from the uplands down through to the that needs to be absolutely strategic, because I'm not sure that some of the current catchment partnerships are actually looking at it strategically enough, with a clear vision about what it is that we're trying to deliver right across that catchment. I think ALMS is an opportunity, the new ALMS scheme, and we need to be making sure that we make the most of that opportunity, and that our land managers are prepared for that, and they can see the opportunities that delivers for them at a landscape scale. I like the word farmers, not just educating them, because I think they can actually give us a lot of information too. They've got a lot of knowledge and expertise, and we need to be careful about our language. And I think we as land managers, as the public, need to accept that there will be change, and that there are potentially going to have to be some trade-offs. We're not going to be able to deliver everything. Talk about fencing on the commons, and maybe that is something that might have to come.
Okay, so I support the points around a holistic approach, land to sea, spatially resolved approaches. I think important also is bringing in a wide range of stakeholders, so bringing in the academics, bringing in the user groups, farmers, up to representatives from DEFRA. We need everybody involved in this. One of the things that really hit home to me was, Alison said earlier that she's heard a lot of what we talked about today for the last 30 years. I think we all have heard a lot of what we talked about for the last 30 years. My final point would be, I think, can we try and learn some lessons from what we've done before? So can we look at what's happened before, see what's been successful and what's failed, and learn from both of those things, because there's lessons to learn from failure, and let that try and shift our way forward. I think that there is an absence of that at the moment, and I think in a panic to achieve this net zero by 2050, there's a risk we won't really take that strategic approach.
Yeah, I mean, again, the whole holistic system, which those of us who've been doing agricultural farming or a version of it for 30 years, it's kind of we're steeped in it. If we don't know any other way. But I think it's really quite useful at the moment is that systems thinking has really come into the public consciousness now. You know, when you look at XR, they talk about system change, and I go to conferences which are inhabited by quite sort of mainstream government departments, and they're talking about getting out of silo thinking. So I think we have a moment now where people don't think, oh, we can only look after that, or if we're looking after that, we're not looking after that. I think people are getting this idea that it's all joined up. And with my land workers hat on, there are so many people who want to come into farming, land management, conservation. We don't have access to land, we don't have access to training, and there's so much energy in people who want to do something. And if we can somehow break down some of these barriers of either access to land, we can look at succession, older farmers who maybe want to give, or enable someone else to use their land in a more holistic way, but they don't just want to sell it. So I think there's loads and loads of opportunities, and there are lots and lots of little bits that we can join up. Joined up food system or joined up land management. It's all there, and I think at the moment, saying we've tried all these things for years and years, and sometimes it doesn't work. I think now people are getting this. It's not just one thing. It's not just the Wales. It's not just the coronavirus. It's all of it. I think we do have a moment to get it now.
My only sort of brief comment is that we must maintain an external view as well. Let's learn from what other people have managed to achieve, but also when we do find something that works for us, let's not be shy to share it. Devon can really act as an ambassador for change and good practice, much more widely.
What we've seen on the ground is that we think, well, we work mainly in South Devon. We think South Devon has enormous potential to show the way for the future because there's so much innovation already happening there. And then the question becomes, how do you join it all up? How do you make it strategic? And that's the work that we'd really like to start looking at. And one idea we have is to create what we call a back room for the bioregion, which gives communities access to expertise in mapping and measuring and creating baselines and key performance indicators, because that's what they're asking for. We haven't talked about drinking water. It's really important because that's probably one of the systems that's going to become most stressed most quickly. There are some ways in which we can address that, like homeowner rainwater harvesting. There are quite a few communities looking at how they can group together and put in rainwater harvesting. You've got that. You don't need to have drinking water used for flushing toilets and all those different things. And we're also very interested in small leverage points, so ways in which we can, there are interventions that one can make that actually kind of unlock a whole cascade of innovation, like buying a mill for a group of farmers so that they can then grow different kinds of pulses and grains and diversify the local food that's available. So I just want to end really on the note that saying there's huge potential, but we need to be strategic in how we go about unlocking it.
And did you want to say about your report?
Yes, thank you, Jill. So hot off the press is this report from our learning journey, and I can send you all a copy in PDF. This is the kind of printed one. And we went around South Devon to Plymouth, to Brixham, to Dartmoor, and the area around Dartington, talking to people on the ground. Herrick's one of the people we talked to. Rebecca came on the journey. Ian helped us organise the fantastic Plymouth Day. And we've come up with a lot of really good facts and interesting findings and point us towards the future.
Thank you. So thinking again about taking a connected approach, obviously we've talked a lot about the importance of connecting up food producers and boosting a more aggregated food distribution network. But thinking about the other side of the coin, it's important to recognise the challenges around consumption. Some of the work I've been doing with Food Exeter, and I know Food Plymouth have been doing similar work as well. We're very, very much aware of the impacts of austerity and the rise of food insecurity, which is a major detriment to people being able to take advantage of the wonderful produce in Devon. So we need to think about governance and the support of vulnerable people and frontline services, and taking what measures we can at a local level to address these issues, and also thinking locally, taking a place-based approach, but also taking advantage of connections with national organisations such as the Sustainable Food Cities Network and the Food Power Alliance Network, who is an incredible sort of knowledge exchange model where we can connect with other people doing similar work around the country and learn best practices.
Yes, good. So, yeah, I think for me there's 5 points, and I'll be as quick as I can. I think it's interesting hearing about the catchment approach and the bioregional approach, and it's got a lot to say for it. I also think that a more of a city-region approach has got a lot to say for it as well, and I think Sustainable Food Cities movement is moving in that direction more now, sustainable food places. So in that regard, I think that local food is, for Plymouth, is from Cornwall, Devon and the seas off those shores, and I think if we think in those terms, I hope it'll be helpful. I think what we haven't really talked about much is urban growing, and I think there's a lot of scope for urban growing. There's some good work going on in Plymouth around that, and potentially more coming. We can link that into tree cover if that can be fruiting and nutting trees rather than just ornamentals, and we've done some work on that as well. And we haven't talked about aquaponics and hydroponics as well, which I think, again, there's a lot of scope in that if that can be got right. In terms of good practice, Cornwall Food Foundation, we've got some links with. We've got a brilliant app they've done through a European link that's called Cool Food is the project, to help us to understand our own carbon footprint of our own consumption and then adjust that. So I think things like that are a great practice to look at. We haven't talked about the Heart of the Southwest Local Enterprise Partnership either. Again, on the Devon-wide work we're doing, we're trying to get some links there. The chair of that partnership really gets natural capital, so I think there's some scope there. They're trying to engage around food, and they're not quite getting it, but they're making some progress. So I think the LEPs, there's something to be done there. And finally, just to mention the RSA and the Food Farming Commission, there's going to be some real action coming out of there. We've got links into that. And I think I just feel there's a big opportunity there with the RSA that we're wise to tap into and link into. Thank you.
Incredible report. They produced an incredible report.
Mm.
Thank you. There are so many hooks from that coming out into action. That would be great. Thank you. And so do you have that report? I expect you might have it quickly, and you could send us a copy to circulate. That would be really helpful. Thank you. So we're going to finish now. We're enormously grateful to all of you here and tell us what you want. And one of the things that we haven't had time to identify is what are the labour points locally. I think we utterly get there are things that will have to be thought about on a larger scale. But and we're of course open to further communication if you wish to send us electronically. This could be done by so and so, here is the link, or we suggest this collaboration.
I imagine we'd all agree that the procurement power of local government is probably the biggest leverage point to a degree.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And it's an urgent thing to take forward.
Yeah.
Good. Well, that point has been made, and I think we shall reflect on all that you said.
I'm writing that down.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Yes, please leave us your post.